All right, guys, what's going on? So I hope everybody's out there staying high speed, working on their goals, whatever they may be. This video is going to be more for people who are looking at going into the military, more specifically the Army, because that's the information that I have for you is all Army-based. And it's going to be focused around the difference between what it's like to be an enlisted soldier versus being an officer. And I'm going to use some of my experience that I have from my 15 years now of experience of being in the Army, both as an enlisted soldier and an officer. I actually spent about 10 years as enlisted, making it all the way up to Sergeant First Class. And then I've got about 5 years of being an officer. And so I'm going to pull a lot from my background and from my experience from being both enlisted and an officer, and try to share with you some insight and some knowledge that can help you make the decision for yourself on whether you want to enlist or go under commission as you make your way into the Army. First, before we go any further, I want to make sure to remind you to like and subscribe. The more of you that actually do that, the more of you out there that are actually going to be able to see this information on YouTube. And I want as many people out there as possible to be able to get this information. So like and subscribe. Thank you very much. All right, so first things first, let's talk about the requirements for enlisted versus officer. What does it take to enlist into the military? All right, so nowadays it really doesn't take too much. You know, you can basically come in with a high school degree. You don't even really need a high school degree. You can actually have a GED, which is high school degree equivalent. That's actually what I did. You take the ASVAB, you get a list of different jobs that are open at the time. You pick one of those jobs and you enlist in the Army. Really, as long as you are passing the medical requirements, and you don't have like a super serious criminal background and you're not on probation at the time, then you'll be able to enlist in the Army. Now, there'll be some catches out there. There might not be the specific job that you're wanting to do in the Army that's open at the time. Let's say you really want to go infantry and you go in there and you test high enough for it, you're medically cleared, you have no issues with going infantry, but they just don't have any infantry slots, you know, that year or maybe even the next year to go to basic training. But you want to join the Army now. Well, you might just not have that option. You might have to settle for being a mechanic, or you might have to go military intelligence, whatever job list they have and whatever slots they have available at the time. And as long as you meet the requirements for that specific job, that's what's going to be available to you at the recruiting station. But the biggest benefit of enlisting in the Army, really, as you're making your transition into service, is that you can just, on a whim, go into the recruiting station and start the process. And honestly, there's a potential that you could just ship out and start your journey the following month. It could be that fast. Now let's look how you could come into the Army immediately as an officer, where there's really only 3 ways to do that. And that's either you can go through ROTC or West Point. You know, you'd go through college for 4 years, you'd earn your bachelor's or your master's degree, and then you'd come in immediately as a lieutenant. You could do a direct commission, which is usually reserved for like doctors and more technical side officers where they already have a degree or they're already a professional in some sort of field, and they just come in and continue working in that field. Or you can go to OCS, the Officer Candidate School, and that's where you come in with a bachelor's degree. You've already got college done, but you come in, you got to go to Officer Candidate School for a few months, and after that begin your officer career. So there's multiple ways that you can go about coming in as an officer, but the one thing that's in common between all those different paths is that you have to have some sort of college degree before you even begin your commissioning process. So when you're looking at it, joining the Army as enlisted versus joining the Army as officer, it's going to take a lot more time and commitment to join the Army as an officer than it would as an enlisted soldier who, you know, could really just come in off the street and join the Army. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just the facts. So that's the way it is. I mean, that's what I did, man. I just one day said, you know what? I think I'm going to join the Army. Went into the recruiting station, joined the Army. That's how it worked for me. No big deal. Now, with knowing what it takes to actually join the Army, enlisted versus officer, let's look at what the potential benefits are for either side. Okay, and the first thing we'll look at is how much money are you going to make if you come in off the street as an enlisted soldier versus what you'd make as an officer. Okay, so now looking at today, 2021, and referencing the military pay chart that is current as of today, an E1, an E-Fuzzy private would come into the Army making $16.50 a month. That's just base pay. All right, you're also going to get, you know, clothing allowance once a year, which I think is like $400 to $600 a year, and then you'll get BAH if you're married. BAH is all dependent on where you live, but it's basically meant to cover your rent expenses every month. But your base pay, your actual paycheck, the money that you're making for being in the Army is going to be $16.50 a month as an E1, all right? Now, if you were to come in after earning your bachelor's degree, after going through ROTC, West Point, whatever you do to actually earn a commission, and you come in as a lieutenant, you would be making $3,386 a month. So that's a big difference. That's a pretty substantial difference. Now, it's easy to look at those numbers and think that that's not really fair, but again, you got to look at like all the time and commitment it takes to just earn a commission, and that's really why the pay scale is that way, because the military has to be able to keep up with how much somebody with a bachelor's degree might be able to be making in the civilian sector, and they have to give you some sort of comparable rate, and that's kind of why it's a pretty good starting pay. All right. Now, going back to what a private makes for their month-to-month pay, it starts rather low, but it starts to pick up pretty quick as well. Now, that first month-to-month paycheck is really how much you're making during basic training. Once basic training is over, you already get $135 raise. Now you're making $17.85, and once you move up to the next rank, which only takes 6 months of service, you're making $2,000 a month. Okay, so you start getting, it starts to add up pretty quickly. You're only an E1 fuzzy for 6 months. You'll be an E2 which is the next rank up, for a year. Then you can get looked at for being promoted for private first class. Now you're making $2,300-ish a month, and then you can be getting looked at for specialists at your 2-year mark or earlier, and now you're pushing $2,500 a month. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on like how your year-to-year pay increases look like enlisted versus officer, but I can tell you that as an officer, your pay increases are going to be much more substantial than if you were enlisted. I'll give you an example. So if you were in the Army, you came in as an enlisted person, and you ended up staying in for 10 years, and I think it's fair to say that you would make at least E5 or E6, and let's just give you the benefit of the doubt because you're high speed and say you make E6, so you're a staff sergeant at 10 years, right? Well, at that point, you would be making $3,883 a month, okay? That's after 10 years. That's going off this pay scale. Obviously, every year there's pay increases to deal with inflation and stuff like that, but that's your basic, that's what you can be looking at, all right? Going back and looking at what an officer might be getting paid at 10 years, it's fair to say that that officer would now be a major, and at that rank, the officer would be making $7,684 a month, okay? So that's a really big difference. Now, other things to consider as far as pay goes, enlisted soldiers, they get bonuses. They get sign-on bonuses for when you first enlist. Those bonuses can be all the way up to $60,000, which is quite hefty. Officers don't get bonuses. The only time officers get bonuses is if they're like a pilot, or they're doing something, super special, and there's just some sort of bonus attached to their monthly paycheck, but it's nowhere near as substantial as $60,000. Both ranks get basic allowance for subsistence, BAS, but the enlisted ranks, I want to say, get like $100 more a month for that. It's around $350 a month. Officers make $250 a month on that, and that's only if you're married and living outside the barracks. Officers do make a little bit more on the BAH side to pay their rent and everything, but it's not a whole lot more. But really, if we're being real with ourselves, officers make a whole lot more money than enlisted do, okay? So if money is a huge driving factor for you, that's something you definitely need to consider. Now, there's a reason why officers make a whole lot more money, and I think we need to now start getting into that, okay? Now, whether you think it's fair or not that the officers make a lot more than the enlisted doesn't really matter. Those are just sort of the facts. But just remember, so far we've talked about it does take a lot more time, commitment to join the Army as an officer than it does as to just enlist. So that is a huge consideration to remember when you're considering money, okay? Now let's look at what the main difference would be as far as what you'd actually be doing in the Army, enlisted versus officer. So the enlisted soldier, it doesn't really matter if you're a private all the way up to a sergeant's major. They are the workforce of the Army. They are the doers of the force. The officers are more like the managers of the force, okay? Enlisted are going through the training. They are more hands-on on pretty much everything that needs to be done. Regardless of what your job is, whether you're infantry, a mechanic, anything, you're going to be the guy actually doing the job. Your hands are going to be getting dirty no matter what. Okay? The officers figure out what it is that the doers need to be doing, and then they motivate them to do it. That's really the best way I can put it. Now I'm gonna break this down a little further using some of my own experience. So I'll give you an example from my own experience, and this is specific to the job that I have. But coming in as a private and joining a recon platoon, I immediately took the position as being a driver of a striker vehicle. Okay, that was my job. I was the driver. Other privates in the platoon, they were either riflemen or gunners in some circumstances. Usually the gunner, being a gunner like in charge of a SAW, or like even the 50 caliber Mark 19 on top of the vehicle, that's usually reserved for enlisted of higher rank, like specialists and sergeants that have a little more experience, so they can use that weapon correctly. But they had a specific role to fill, and they fulfilled that role expertly. All I had to do was listen to what my leaders told me to do, and I executed. I did. Okay, I didn't really have to think too much about how we were going to get certain places, how our training was going to get conducted. I didn't have to think about who was going to be bringing the food out to the field, or how long we'd be out in the field. I didn't have to worry about all that. I just did what I was told and had to do it to the best of my ability. All right, that was the judge on whether I was a good enlisted soldier or not. How well did I do my job? Now, looking at what life in a platoon would be like as an officer, through the perspective of being in an infantry platoon, the officer, the lieutenant, the PL, would go in there and they would be responsible for organizing training events, organizing when, where, and how all the supplies and food and water would be available for the troops, making sure that everybody knew what their job was and how they should be conducting it. It's all managerial. There's a whole lot less doing and a lot more of planning. And you'd be spending a lot of time on the computer figuring all that stuff out, bringing your plans to different meetings and getting approval for your plans from your commanders, gathering what the intent is from your commanders, and making sure that your platoon is conducting their operations according to the commander's intent. So it's much less one-sided. It's just a much bigger picture, and your responsibilities are much higher. So bringing it back, as an enlisted guy, as a driver of that striker vehicle, I was responsible for everything that vehicle did or didn't do. All right, so that was very low level. As a platoon leader, I was responsible for everything that platoon did or didn't do. So every vehicle, every person, every mission that was conducted, everything was on the shoulders of me as a platoon leader. Okay, so the responsibility factor there is much higher. So looking at the two, you have to decide on whether or not you want to be the doer or you want to be responsible for the group of doers. If there's one thing I've learned so far about being an officer, is that you are responsible for everything, okay? Everything is your fault. And if you can deal with that, and that's not a problem, or if you're, a really good motivator and you consider yourself to be a good leader, then that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. That means you'll be responsible for all the good things that happen in the platoon as well, okay? But that's just something you have to consider. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what the difference is as far as progression into the military, what promotions look like, what sort of schooling opportunities you might get, and the differences in assignments, okay, enlisted versus officer. All right, so enlisted, what you'll do is everybody will go to basic training, regardless of your MOS. There's different basic training sites that you'll go to, but everybody will go to basic training, which is like 4 months long. After that, you'll go to AIT. If you're infantry or Cav Scout or something like that, you'll do what's known as OSET, which is one station unit training. It's just you do your basic and your AIT at the same place. But if you're pretty much anything else, after basic training, you'll go to AIT, and that's additional advanced individual training that you'll do. That's anywhere between 2 to 10 months additional training before you actually go to your first unit. Once you get to your first unit, you'll be put into your role. Whatever it is that your MOS is, you'll be put into that basic entry-level role, and you'll fill it, and you'll start doing your job. Like I said, you'll be different levels of private all the way up to roughly 2 years. That's when you get looked at for specialist, and then you typically start getting looked at for NCO ranks non-commissioned officer or sergeant at your 3 to 4 year mark, and you have to go to a localized promotion board and sit in front of a board and actually pass that board in order to earn your stripes. And you'll do the same thing for staff sergeant, which is normally earned around 6 to 8 years. And then once you get looked at for senior NCO ranks, which is sergeant first class and above, that's when you'll start getting looked at by like Big Army on whether or not you should be getting promoted or not. You can expect to start getting looked at for senior non-commissioned officer ranks around your 8 year mark, typically 8 to 10 years. That's pretty much the norm, I'd say. So you got to put in some time before you earn some like serious seniority as a non-commissioned officer in the enlisted ranks. Now, as an officer, you, like I said, you got to go through college first. You'll earn a commission. You'll get a start date for your basic officer leaders course, which is all dependent on the branch that you will branch. And you'll go through that basic officer leaders course, and that's going to be anywhere between 6 months to a year. Once you finish that course, you'll go off to your first unit. Most officers, most lieutenants are going to fill the role as being a platoon leader in some way. Now there is a difference between like being a platoon leader in an infantry platoon and a platoon leader in an engineers platoon or a military intelligence platoon, but usually you'll fill the role as a platoon leader. But there are some jobs out there where you might not ever see platoon leader time. More often than not, your first unit, you won't become a platoon leader right away. Usually they'll put you in some sort of staff position for the first 6 months to a year, just to sort of get your feet wet, get you used to how the unit operates, and just sort of show you the ropes and show you how things are done in the unit that you're now in. Once you become a platoon leader, you're going to end up being a platoon leader for about a year to a year and a half. Then you'll either do some sort of specialty job or go back to staff. You get promoted to first lieutenant after 2 years of time, and you get promoted to captain after 4 years of time. And those are essentially automatic promotions. Once you get promoted to captain, you won't get looked at for major for another 6 years. But I'd say the biggest difference between promotions from enlisted and officer is that promotions for officers are much more rigid. At a certain year mark, that's when you're getting looked at for promotion. It's like at 2 years you make first lieutenant, 4 years you make captain, 10 years you make major, and so on and so forth. For enlisted, it's not really like that. Now, at 2 years, you usually make specialist, but after that, it's pretty much up to you, all right? It's whether or not you earn it. It's whether or not you go to the board. It's whether or not you're hitting the right marks and fulfilling the right jobs, but it's a lot more, it's much less fluid, and it's going to be more up to you to either be very successful in your progression in the ranks or not successful. So if you're a high-speed go-getter, being an enlisted soldier and earning those NCO ranks shouldn't really be an issue. But if you're kind of a slacker and you don't really have good leadership skills and you're not a very good worker, you might not ever become a non-commissioned officer. Now, with all that being said, progression through the ranks as an enlisted soldier can be a little more fluid in the sense that you don't necessarily need to fill specific job roles in order to be competitive for the next rank. Now, there are specific roles that you can expect to do as an enlisted soldier. Like I said, typically as a private, you're going to be fulfilling that, basic role. Either you're going to be like a rifleman, a driver, you'll be a mechanic, an intel analyst, something very basic level. Once you move a little bit more into your time and you start looking at like the specialist to sergeant rank, you're going to have, anywhere between 2 to 6 soldiers working under you in those roles, and you'll be fulfilling more of like a team leader role or a gunner role, something like that. But you'll have a little bit more leadership skills built at this point, and you'll be actually putting that leadership to work. Once you start doing that, and you show that you have good leadership skills, and your team is successful, that's when you start getting looked at for the more senior ranks. But there is no fixed timeline for the NCO structure. There are times when it's normal for soldiers to be getting looked at for sergeant or staff sergeant, so on and so forth. But it's a little bit more up to you on how that progression will look for you individually in your career. For officers, it's a little different. There's what is known as key development roles, okay? And those are roles that you must do, and you must do them successfully. In fact, you have to do these like above your peers in order to be competitive for the next rank. So for example, in order to make captain, a key development role is to be a platoon leader. Okay, so you had to have fill the role as being a platoon leader, and you had to do it successfully in order to be competitive to become a captain. To become a major, you had to fill the role of a commander. And typically you'll have to be a commander for 18 months to 2 years, and you have to complete that key developmental time and at a high level in order to be competitive for the rank of major. And you're competing against your peers across the entire Army. All right, so you have to hit these marks at a certain time. You have to hit them in the correct job field, and you have to hit them at a high level. You have to be very successful, or you just won't be competitive and you won't make that next rank as an officer. But being an officer and looking at promotions and what your job may or may not be, it's a lot more rigid, it's a lot more directed. You kind of know what your career timeline is, 10 years ahead of time. Whereas being an enlisted soldier, you don't really have to think too far out in your career, and you can still be successful in that progression in rank. Now, looking at different opportunities for experience or growth, enlisted versus officer, both enlisted and officers have a lot of opportunities that the Army makes available to them, and I can tell you from experience that's absolutely a fact. If you were joining as an enlisted soldier and you have no college experience whatsoever, but it's always been your dream to go to college, the Army offers you plenty of opportunity to pursue college degrees. You get tons of free money. Now, they might not give you time, but they definitely give you the availability and the resources in order to go and get like a degree online or something like that. You'll also be afforded tons of opportunity to go to, very specialized schooling. You're looking at Ranger School, Air Assault School, Airborne School, RSLIC, so on and so forth. Like I said, the enlisted are more of the doers, so they have to go get that specialized, individualized training in order to be a better doer. Now, the only thing is, an enlisted soldier doesn't have as much pool to be able to ask their unit to go to these sorts of schools until they start looking at the rank of like specialist to sergeant. And it's going to be a lot more competitive for them to be chosen over their peers in the unit because there's just a lot more enlisted soldiers at the unit. So you really have to be the one to stand out in your platoon or in your company, in your battalion, so that you will be the one that the commander wants to send to that school. But again, if you're really highly motivated and you're a high-speed individual, that should be no issue for you. Another cool thing for the enlisted in specific, as far as opportunities go, is when it's time to look at re-enlisting, you'll be given incentives to re-enlist, and a lot of times those incentives will look like a specific school that you really wanted to go. They'll guarantee to send you to that school, or they'll give you what's known as a degree completion time. Sometimes some units will give you like 6 months just to go to college and just work on your degree, and that's your job for the next 6 months. They let you do something like that. Or they'll give you an assignment of choice. If you re-enlist, you can go to a specific Army post or area and be assigned there and work there if you re-enlist. So that's pretty cool. Officers don't re-enlist. Officers just stay in until they ask to retire, and that's it. They don't get the opportunity to re-enlist and be afforded those sorts of opportunities at a re-enlistment. But that doesn't mean officers don't get opportunities, and it is, in my opinion, that officers are afforded a lot more educational and institutional opportunities, even assignment opportunities, than enlisted. And that's just me speaking personally. As an officer, you will already have a degree of some sort, but you will be required to go to certain schools like basic officer leaders course. You'll have to go to captain's career course, so on and so forth. And those schools are already going to give you a lot of good knowledge, a lot of good education on leadership, what your specific job role will be. You'll also be afforded to go to those troop schools, like I mentioned before, Ranger School, Air Assault School, Airborne. And a lot of times those schools will be grouped into your initial training, like your basic officer leaders course. So for example, as an infantry officer, you go through the IBOLIC, Infantry Basic Officer Leaders course, and then immediately after that, you go to Ranger School. Like, you have to go to Ranger School. So you definitely get a shot to go to Ranger. After that, if you're going to an airborne unit, you'll get to go to Airborne School. If you're going to an Air Assault unit, you'll go to Air Assault School. And during your time in between being assigned to a unit and being done with school, let's say you have like a couple months of in-between time, more likely than not, you'll have the opportunity to go pursue any school you want, as long as it's okay with the schoolhouse to do so. As an officer, you're also afforded different opportunities as far as assignments go. You're able to do broadening assignments, which can include anything between going and earning a master's degree at college, or maybe you get some sort of fellowship at the White House. There's a lot of opportunities out there for officers. There's opportunities like that for enlisted as well. They typically don't start opening up until you're at least a staff sergeant, but normally it's sergeant first class, and you're looking at 8 to 10 years of service at that point if you're high speed. As an officer, these kinds of opportunities open up to you as a captain, which is 4 years in. A lot of times you have to have company command time done first, but that's still only 6, maybe 8 years tops. All right, and you start getting a lot more opportunities being afforded to you. But as an officer, like I talked about before, you have to complete those key developmental times and job assignments before you can even begin to think about applying for these broadening opportunities that the Army lets you do. So you have to be able to use time management throughout your entire career as an officer in order to even think about going and taking advantage of some of these additional opportunities. Whereas being an enlisted soldier, it's a lot less stringent. You can kind of do it more on a whim. You're just going to have to serve a little bit longer before you can actually start taking advantage of them. All right, so I think I got most of the details down as far as what the difference is between an enlisted soldier and an officer is in the Army, and what you can expect the experience to be like. Just remember, at the end of the day, no matter what your job is, it really comes down to that the enlisted is the backbone of the Army. They are the doers of the Army. Okay, you have a job, you do your job. As the officer, you're more of the planner or the manager, and you're going to be doing a lot less hands-on, and you're going to be more focused on leadership and making sure that all your doers have everything available to them in order to do their job, and that they actually are doing their job. I don't think I can really sum it up any better than that. So there's the information. If there's anybody watching this that has any additional information that I might have forgot, or if you have any other questions that I may not have thought about, just please go ahead and drop that in the comments for everybody. And remember, if you have the choice on whether or not to join the Army as an enlisted soldier or as an officer, I would encourage you not to think too much about the pay side of things, and think more about what speaks more to your own personality, what you think you'd be more motivated to do throughout your days, and however you think you could be a better asset to the Army as a whole and to the people that you work with. That would be the best decision to go with, because the more motivated of a soldier that you are while you're serving, the better off it's going to be for you, the better off it's going to be for your team, and the better off it's going to be for the Army. The more you're going to get out of it. All right? So just remember that. Again, if you like this kind of thing, I have other videos on career enhancements, going to Army schools. We talk about military fitness, so on and so forth. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Make sure you're telling your friends about Gritty Soldier, because it's a great place to get information. Besides that, I don't have anything else for you, and I'll see you on the next one.